Welcome back to Nate the Hate, where I am once again joined by everyone's Australian mate, MVG.
What's going on, Nate? It's been an interesting day.
It has been an interesting day, and it is a day where we finally have answers to all the questions surrounding the PlayStation 5, except for, price point and release date, but we finally have some official specs, and it came in the most obscure and, I guess you would say, educational manner that Sony could have ever factored in. I mean, instead of doing a consumer type of event, they did a GDC style presentation where Mark Cerny lectured us on the specs of the PlayStation 5, and that's where we'll start today's conversation. What were your thoughts on the PlayStation 5 architectural lecture given earlier today?
Well, this was a GDC style conference, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this was something that was scheduled for GDC, I believe, as part of GDC week. And obviously, with the situation around the world, that was something that got obviously cancelled. So Sony did decide that they would bring out their talk that they were supposed to have at GDC with regards to the future of video games, the PlayStation 5. So I went into it knowing that it was going to be a very technical discussion. I actually did a live stream of it today with folks that like my channel, and I did give them a heads up that there's probably not going to be anything about the console as far as the design, probably nothing as far as games, definitely no price point, and definitely no release date. This is really going to be a deep dive into the technical architecture of the system. We'll learn more about its performance, the CPU, the GPU, the SSDs, how things work. And we got that. We definitely got that from Sony. He was very meticulous, as he usually is with these things, and walked us through the SSD ability, which, quite honestly, was very, very impressive. Probably the most impressive part of the PlayStation 5 at this point. And then discuss the GPU architecture, which was a little disappointing. I'm not going to lie. I didn't think it was where it needs to be, at least on paper. Obviously time will tell when we start to see some games, but at least on paper right now, the GPU seemed a little lacking, at least compared to the Series X. The CPU, which was, roughly around the same as the Series X, maybe a slightly lower clock speed there, and the 3D audio discussion at the end with the Tempest 3D stuff, which that sounded pretty good, pretty interesting on paper again, but it also, and Nate, I wanna turn this over to you, but the Tempest 3D stuff, while it sounded really interesting, also felt like they were still very much in the I don't want to say R&D phase, because I think we're well and truly past that. Hopefully we are, but more about we're not sure what the final iteration of this is going to be when we go to retail. And that really kind of raised some, not red flags, but some concerns with me, because it just feels like that Sony well and truly needs to be, getting the final prototypes for retail ready to rock and roll. I mean, we need to be thinking about what this is going to launch at as far as price and when it's going to launch. So it makes me wonder, where Sony really is truly with their next gen hardware. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it was an interesting piece where they started talking about the 3D audio and wanting to render our ear canals. And that's like it's an awesome feature on paper, but it still sounded like they were kind of still tinkering with it. They're still engineering the actual feature set for it. And typically by now, the silicon and at least launch features are finalized, because you're gearing up towards manufacturing at this point. And you can still tinker with some of the software and such. You always release a firmware update, typically day one, especially with new hardware. So that's nothing unusual. I mean, the Wii U had a day one firmware update that added online, Miiverse, and tons of basic features that you would have expected right out of the box. So it does feel like Sony is, I don't want to say necessarily behind, but I think Microsoft caught Sony a little bit off guard with how prepared Microsoft is at this stage. I mean,
Most definitely.
yeah, last year we saw Sony at this point last year. Sony was coming out, they were doing the interviews with Wired. They were talking about ray tracing and all these other features that the PlayStation 5 was going to have, but they still weren't really talking specifics about the specs or willing to show the hardware itself. And even as of October of last year, everyone was saying, what is Microsoft doing? Microsoft has been silent. We had that brief teaser type thing they had at E3 where they showed Halo Infinite, but otherwise they really didn't make any mention of Anaconda at the time. And then all of a sudden we're in mid to late November of 2019, and rumors hit that no developers have a Anaconda development kit, and Phil Spencer immediately goes to Twitter and says, well, I have a development kit. And a few weeks later, we're at the Game Awards, and there's Microsoft with Xbox Series X, and they show us Hellblade 2. They show us the system itself. They show us the controller. They reveal some specs at the time. And since December, Microsoft, every month, it feels like they're dropping new information. And we know basically everything spec-wise about the Series X prior to today, and Microsoft just unloaded new information yesterday where they let Digital Foundry and other outlets get actual hands-on with the system itself, and they tested the backwards compatibility, the software suspend feature where they suspended, I think it was up to what, 5 Xbox One and Xbox 360 games at a time, and they went right back into the software and it booted up. Most times I believe it was around 6 seconds. Mm-hmm. And we finally got the information from Sony today. And as you said, I mean, Sony came out and said, oh, we have the faster SSD. Great. You have a comparable CPU with both using the Zen 2 cores. The Series X comes in at 3.8 gigahertz. Sony's coming at 3.5 gigahertz, but that's a variable frequency. And then the GPU, Microsoft's been, shouting and showboating that 12 teraflop figure. And Sony comes out today and says, we're at 10.28 teraflops, but that's also at a variable frequency, which means the 10.28 is its maximum performance, as Sony detailed, a boost mode.
Yeah.
So that means in reality, the GPU of the PS5 is the 9.2 teraflop figure that we actually saw leak earlier in the year. And, to some that might be concerning because, it sounds fairly significant, 12 to 9. But people shouldn't focus on the teraflop figure alone. There's a lot more factors and variables that go into, software development and game performance. And then like the RAM, they're both 16 gigabyte GDDR6. Though Sony is unified, Microsoft has a little different bit of a setup there. But the big difference, aside from the SSD, is the I/O throughput, where Microsoft is actually lagging well behind Sony in this department, because the Series X is coming in at 2.4 gigabytes a second raw, or 4.8 gigabytes a second compressed, and the PS5 is coming in at 5.5 gigabytes a second raw, or 8 to 9 gigabytes compressed. And maybe you can detail to the people exactly what I/O throughput is and how that's going to affect what we're seeing on a screen.
Well, it's really just about, the things like loading speeds will be significantly reduced. I mean, Sony kept kind of talking about, almost instantaneous loading. And I think with those numbers, that's definitely achievable. And then Sony was also discussing, a scene in a game where when the player is turning around in a 3D world, is pulling in textures real time off the SSD. I mean, with that amount of throughput, that is something that's achievable and significant. And that really, if done correctly, and if developers embrace those things, could really change the way we think about video games. Because all of a sudden, you don't have to pause to pull in new textures or do things that you would normally do in a traditional sense. It means that, and I'm thinking a little bit ahead, but we've heard stories about how video games are going to change, how the scenes will be more dynamic, in a 3D world where things will change. And one good example is Death Stranding, when you encounter one of the enemies, the world kind of changes into that black tar type of thing. You expect to see those types of things where literally textures are just being streamed in, and there's no juddering, there's no stuttering, there's no loading. Well, I mean, there's loading, but you just don't see it. And I think the Sony PS5 is really geared up for that type of experience, which is actually really impressive if those numbers are actually true. And I'm not saying they're not, but they could be maximum limits, of course. And what does the real world tell us when we start to see games? But I'm pretty impressed with the IO stuff, the SSD stuff. I think that's definitely a lot of the focus of the PS3, and Sony is very proud of that. And that really goes back to Sony's presentation, where he literally spent 20 minutes discussing it. Some people on my live stream felt like he went on a little too long, and I probably agree with that. But I do think it's a very important feature of the PlayStation 5, and one that we should not discount as well. I'd rather have more teraflops, than throughput. Mm-hmm. I mean, at the end of the day, you don't really know the answer to that. I mean, again, it goes back to what we're going to see with next gen games, and if they pull this off, this may be the new normal for video games. But with that said, the Series X is no slouch either. I mean, we saw some demos where they were, like you said, they were kind of flicking between games. We saw some loading speed comparisons that were going on, and I mean, look, there's nothing wrong with the Series X in this regard. They obviously have spent a lot of time, beefing up their I/O throughput as well. So it really just comes down to what we're going to see developers make as far as video games, and again, with games being cross-platform, is there going to be that lowest common denominator now, where they're not going to necessarily optimize for the PS5? They're just going to say, well, the Series X is the lowest common denominator, so we're just going to work off of that model, and we're not going to see any significant improvement on the PS5 side. So a lot to really think about there. But PS5 for me on the throughput stuff is far and away the winner there, and I'm interested to see, and I'm very excited to see what they make of that with games that come out for it.
Yeah, when I was looking at the specs today, it kind of gave me flashbacks to the early 2000s, where we would always have the specs to compare, like the PS2 to the Xbox to the GameCube.
Yep.
And Sony and Microsoft would give you those theoretical maximums of polygons per second. And I remember the PlayStation 2 at the time, it said we could do 60 million polygons a second. The Xbox came out, we're doing 120 million polygons a second. And then you had Nintendo came out, and Nintendo gave you real world performance figures. And they're like, the GameCube can do 6 to 12 million polygons a second. But if you didn't know like what real world performance was, you're looking at the GameCube, you're like, oh my God, it can't compete to the PS2. But as we know, looking in hindsight, the GameCube outperformed the PlayStation 2 in many ways. Mm-hmm. And when I was looking at the spec sheet today with, the variable frequencies and raw uncompressed for the I/O throughput, it reminded me of those days a little bit of, we're getting these figures, but we're not necessarily going to get this performance out of them due to real world actuality of games. So it gave me some of those quick thoughts. I was like, oh boy, we're kind of back at those days where we're going to get all these fancy numbers, where they're going to high mark them, and in reality probably not going to achieve that ceiling.
Yeah.
But like, as you touched on for the SSD, it's a big deal for Microsoft and Sony. And the other day we saw Microsoft detail their solution for expandable storage with games, where they're going with basically a memory stick, we'll put it. Mm-hmm. And Sony is going to allow you to, just go off and get an off-shelf NVMe drive and pop it into the PlayStation 5. But they have said it has to be certified. Yeah. And right now, it's not even existent. It's not something I can go out right now and buy at a store and stockpile in hopes of using on my PlayStation 5. But at least we know the solution, that both are going for expandable storage. And even though they're going with a different approach, one thing they'll have in common is it's going to be expensive.
Oh yeah, no doubt. And for me, Microsoft and Sony have been very, very set in their ways with storage, because typically Microsoft have always had, I'll say, customized expandability solutions. Like if you think about the Xbox 360, that drive that you would stick on the top of the system that had a hard drive installed, and then you could expand it with bigger hard drives. And then the Xbox One, I mean, there's other than USB, there's no easy way to install a bigger drive into the Xbox One. But the PS3, the PS4, both those systems, you can just take out the drives on those and just put in bigger drives. Sony's always been more open, I guess is the word, as far as expandability. So not a big surprise for me that they just made NVMe SSD available as expandable storage. And honestly, even though the drives don't exist right now, I do think for me it's probably the right play that they did that. But they will be expensive, no doubt. And Microsoft will have a 1 terabyte expansion card. It's going to be expensive as well. I have no idea what the cost will be. I'm hopeful that by the time these systems do come out at the end of this year, which we may ask the question towards the end of this episode whether that's actually going to happen. But will the cost of those drives start to decrease as far as SSD or NVMe storage? In general, whether that price will be lower. But I mean, interesting solutions on both systems. For this one, Nate, I don't know if you agree, but I favor Sony's solution, even though those drives don't exist yet. I think it's more of a future-proofing over the Xbox solution, where I think it's going to annoy people about the cost of a 1 terabyte expansion card.
Yeah, the proprietary nature of the Microsoft memory card, it definitely has me concerned because it's bringing back flashbacks of the PlayStation Vita, where Sony completely botched the pricing of that. And I'm hopeful that Microsoft knows that they have to be competitively priced on this, especially since they're not giving us an alternative solution to store games, because the expandable hard drives is just for backwards compatibility and backup saves. So it's definitely a concern. I mean, it's also a concern with Sony and the certified drives, because if these drives come out and they're costing $300, and let's say Microsoft's coming in at $350 for one of the memory sticks, that's a lot of money. We're looking at maybe 60 to 75% of the cost of the system itself. And a conversation a lot of people had this generation in regards to the Nintendo Switch was the price of micro SD cards. And it's still a conversation that goes on today. People say, hey, they only gave us 32 gigabytes of storage. We have to buy a micro SD card. And some of these are pricey. I mean, a 1 terabyte one right now, I think, costs about $250 to $300, which, I mean, that is expensive. You don't need a 1 terabyte micro SD card for a Nintendo Switch game storage. But it's just the idea that it's not easily accessible. Like right now, I can just go out and buy any hard drive, plug it into my PS4 or Xbox One, and I get all that access. I have a 2 terabyte external hard drive on my Xbox One right now, and it's as simple as just plugging into the USB. And I mean, I understand why this is happening. This is the really only solution there is for them. I probably would favor Sony in this, because I think those drives are going to come down in price significantly faster than what Microsoft is going to do with their proprietary tech, because accessories are an avenue to make more money. Yeah. They're always going to charge you a premium. So even if it costs Microsoft $50, they're still going to want to sell it for $150 because they want that $100 revenue.
Yeah.
So,
and they can't sell these things at a loss. Like you could sell a console at break even or a loss because you get your money back, but external storage like this, there's no way that they can sell this at a loss, because I mean, anyone could just buy 100 of these drives and make money off of them. So it doesn't make any sense. So they really have to make a profit on every single drive sale, which means these things will not be cheap.
Right. And that's going to be an obstacle for both console manufacturers going into this generation. So really neither one has an advantage, a distinct advantage over the other. They both have to do something to address this. And in a way, Microsoft almost has a solution that I just came to mind. Microsoft has xCloud. So you can stream a lot of these games. So maybe if you don't like, we don't know everything of how Microsoft is going to use these features. Microsoft could have it where I don't have space on my hard drive. Could I just store a portion of it and stream the rest from xCloud via Game Pass? Whereas Sony doesn't really have, they have their own streaming cloud solution, but it's nowhere near the level that we've seen from Microsoft. Like Microsoft has been cultivating these fruits for years.
Yeah.
And now they're blossoming and we're finally harvesting them. And Sony is still kind of at that, they're planting the seeds towards this future that Microsoft has already arrived to.
Yeah, I mean, Microsoft is well and truly ahead of the game here. And like you said, I mean, xCloud could very well just integrate into the Series X very easily in that, hey, try this game out on Series X, or if you don't have enough hard drive space, no worries, just play it on xCloud. You know, it's right here for you to play, no problem. And your save file will carry over if you decide to install the game on your hard drive if you've got enough space to do so. I mean, I think the opportunities and the options here are endless. There's many different scenarios that Microsoft could go with in order to make the xCloud kind of experience to seamlessly integrate into the Series X, just in the same way back in the 360 days where they integrated Xbox Live into the 360. When you turn the system on, Xbox Live was already up and running. It wasn't really anything you had to mess with. It was just there, and I think, you know, they can do very similar things with xCloud on the Series X.
Absolutely. And that's definitely something to be potentially excited for. It's something I want to see Microsoft detail in the future and see how they really are going to fully integrate xCloud into the Series X, because they have expressed their ambitions to do so. Now, I want to jump to the GPU performance of the Series X and the PlayStation 5.
This is where it gets interesting.
Now, not necessarily the raw figures of 12 versus 10 or the potential even lower with the 9 teraflop figure for the PlayStation 5. But what do you think from, you know, kind of a development background, what are your thoughts on the variable clock speeds versus the static clock speeds of the Series X? Because Sony has that variable frequency for the GPU, and Microsoft's just locked in. It's 12 teraflops. It is performing at 1.8 gigahertz, and you know, Sony's theoretical maximum is 2.23 gigahertz for 10.28 teraflops performance.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the static versus variable?
Well, I mean, let's kind of keep this really simple and say, if you've got variable clock speeds on both your GPU and CPU, it's because you're trying to, you know, regulate your power consumption. Like if you're playing an indie game that's a 2D side scroller that doesn't need maximum GPU and CPU clocks running, then sure, I mean, a variable frequency is exactly what you want. You want to drop those clocks down to an appropriate speed for a lock 60 frames per second. So I totally get that, but I also question why it's important that they do have a variable frequency. Why they just don't, you know, max out the GPU and the CPU like in the same way Microsoft was very quick to mention in their presentation. And I think what it comes down to, Nate, is that it really just is something that Sony is very concerned about, you know, the power draw on this stuff, and maybe it goes back to the fans and things like that, the amount of noise. Now, Microsoft were, again, they were very confident in their presentation where they said this thing's going to be whisper quiet. We've engineered this thing to perfection. And that's a very impressive thing to say, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing or not hearing the noise that comes out of the Series X, especially when this when essentially everything's just going to be running max at full speed all the time. But I think the thing that was interesting to me with Sony today was I don't know if you caught this, but Sony was talking about these kind of maximum theoretical limits of like 2.23 gigahertz. But he also said something along the lines of, and forgive me because maybe I'm not saying it exactly the same way, but he said something along the lines of, right now our developers are about 10% less than that. And I was thinking to myself, what does that mean? Why? Why wouldn't you be targeting the maximum GPU frequency that is available to you? And it just kind of poses more questions as to why Sony is going down this path with the GPU stuff. And I guess to answer your question, I'm not really sure, what the overarching reasoning behind that would be, other than to say that I think Sony may be more concerned about, power consumption, power draw, fan speeds, and noise and heat. So maybe it goes back to the motherboard design and maybe trying to regulate heat better. And look, those dev kits, the Buck Rogers kits, we kept hearing how they had an insane amount of heat coming out of them. Look, we can't really compare dev kits to retail, but it's really something that we only have to go on because we don't have anything else to compare it to at the moment on the Sony camp. So maybe it's really just more a case of, look, we're trying to make sure that these things don't overheat or get too hot, and maybe that's the key thing they're trying to do. What do you think?
It's interesting because if I was a developer, I would say, Microsoft laid it out. It's static. I don't have to make a decision about the CPU or the GPU clocks. It's just Microsoft has given me one. That's what I can work with. And Sony's kind of introduced, a multiple choice question to me now, where I actually have options available to me where I can take advantage of the CPU maybe in a certain area. And then later on in the game, I might want to push a little more of the GPU out so I can, kind of pick and choose of what I need at a given time. Whereas Microsoft is just, here's everything, do with it as you please. I think it does come back to energy efficiency, because we did see Cerny talk about it today of this really isn't going to be that significant of a power draw, especially like we've seen the companies go for more efficient designs over the last couple of generations, especially because it's an important thing in Japan. They have certain protocol and they want machines to come in below a certain wattage. And we saw, even I think it was late last year, you had Microsoft and Sony sign on saying they're going to reduce their carbon footprint and they're going for more green designs and such.
Yeah.
And it seems like the PlayStation 5 is definitely going in that direction with this type of decision. But I still wonder exactly what a developer feels like that about the static, or in this case, the variable frequencies of the CPU and GPU. So I'd like to see some interviews be conducted with them to see their honest opinions on it. Because, Sony's going to come out and make it say, oh, it's great, everyone loves it. But there's probably a third-party developer who's sitting there saying, this complicates my port a slight bit. Because if we're using everything that Microsoft is giving us, we might have to find an area to compromise bringing it to the PlayStation 5. Whereas if it was just a static locked frequency, they would still probably have some sort of compromise there, but wouldn't be as much decision making to be had. This kind of reminds me a little bit of how we have the Switch. We have docked and undocked mode. Mm-hmm. There are different frequencies for CPU, I believe, correct? The GPU is always at its max.
It's the other way around. The CPU is locked. CPU. Actually, no. Okay. No, you're right, Nate. I'm sorry. The CPU is variable. The GPU is locked, yes.
Okay. So it's similar to that, actually. So it's kind of the Switch and the PS5 have something in common.
Yeah, I think we're on the same. We're thinking the same things. I'm comparing this to my biggest concern with. Well, I have some concerns about the Series X, but the one that I always kind of come back to is how many different environments does Xbox have to support now, where they have an ecosystem of different systems. We know the VCR is still going to stick around at least for a little while longer after the Series X is out. The One X isn't going to go away anytime soon. The One S will be around as well. Probably for a year and a half, maybe 18 months, maybe 2 years. But I guess at launch, they have to support 4 systems. I mean, I don't think Lockhart is something that's going to happen at least this year. So let's take that off the table. But now all of a sudden, you've got a defined, roadmap or requirements as to, okay, you need to target this processor that has 1.825 gigahertz at 12 teraflops and 52 CUs. That's fixed at that performance. You're targeting this CPU as well. It's fixed at that performance. There's no variable stuff that kind of throws developers off their game and wonder exactly what is the target performance they need to start thinking about to make games run all across their different systems. And I think with that variable frequency on the PS5, they still have to support PS4 Pro and PS4 games, at least in the short term. Again, now all of a sudden developers are probably thinking, well, what am I supposed to target for here? What do I do? And I'm sure Sony has best practices documentation on what they should be doing, but it also just throws in additional questions that really should never be asked in the first place. It's like, what is the target that I'm supposed to be working with now? And the answer is, well, it's variable. And I mean, to a developer, that's like, well, what am I supposed to do with that information? So I think you're right. I think a variable frequency is I mean, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I do think it is, at the end of the day, it is for a power consumption or power reduction, I should say, and energy, efficiency, which, I respect Sony for doing that. But I also think it just opens up more questions that really don't need to be asked. And I think at the end of the day, Microsoft has put a stake in the ground and said, look, this is what we're targeting. Developers, have at it. This is the high end that you need to target your games for, and this is not going to change. And I think that's definitely a bold statement, and one that's definitely the right choice. When you're talking about a next generation, high end console, I don't think the word variable really needs to be mentioned anywhere in any spec sheet. It has to be, this is what we're doing with our hardware. And I do think Sony really needs to, the strategy there on that one was probably not the right move. I think they really need to just come up with a fixed, performance as far as CPU and GPU.
So based on everything we know today, I've been, I guess you would call me an advocate for Microsoft over the last 3 or 4 months, because whenever we talked about the Series X, I've kind of been that guy on the Spawncast saying, don't dismiss Microsoft yet.
You have. That's absolutely correct.
And people who listen call me an Xbox fanboy. Others say it's out of his mind. Sony's going to come out and, destroy it. And I mean, after today, I mean, not to, toot my own horn, I think after today, if I'm Microsoft, I'm feeling really good about myself.
Absolutely. Microsoft has, like you said, Nate, from pretty much the Game Awards, or even before that, the Phil Spencer tweet with the, hey, I've got a dev kit at home. What are you guys talking about? But really, it started with the Game Awards, right? From that moment till today, they have controlled the narrative. They have completely overshadowed Sony, that have been very, very quiet. And, my hope was that, their silence was, a confident silence, that they would come back and really just kind of blow our socks off. And honestly, it wasn't even a fair fight, it was a full reveal where, like you said, they literally took the system apart and walked Digital Foundry through every piece of the architecture and the hardware, and then made them put it all back together again, put it back in the box, to a GDC style conference that, I mean, Sony didn't even stand a chance. Now, it doesn't really matter whether it was targeted for GDC people or if it was for the public. At the end of the day, it was, tweeted about, and a lot of people saw this. I think over 600,000, people watched the Sony thing today, and it wasn't even a fair fight. It was like a featherweight against a heavyweight ultimately, and it really showed to me that although Sony has some great ideas, and I do think the system is going to be a great system when it comes out, especially with their games lineup that they have. But apart from that, from a technical standpoint, there's no comparison. I mean, the Series X just kills it on paper. It's technically the more impressive next gen console, and if Microsoft stick to the plan, they are going to come out this next gen all guns blazing, and they're going to sell a lot of Series X systems. And if I was Sony, I'd be a little bit worried right now. I'd be wondering what we need to do to get things back on track, And for me, I would say it's time to stop, messing around with theoretical, PowerPoint slide decks and diagrams and stuff, and we need to see something. We need to see some real hardware. We need to see a controller. We need to see some demos that Sony was talking about. He kept saying, the developers in-house, they love this feature and they love that feature. That's great, Mark, but let's see something. Show us something. Microsoft showed us the ray tracing of Minecraft, the ray tracing stuff, which I thought was impressive, but I didn't really think it was like that impressive, and I kind of felt like it left the door open for Sony to maybe show a Gran Turismo Sport with ray tracing, or one of their last gen or the current gen games with ray tracing enabled. And I felt like that would have more of an impact on the public and at least myself from a demonstration standpoint, because it's more impressive graphically. The Minecraft demo was cool. I liked it. I definitely really appreciated the stuff that they did there, but Sony didn't really, they didn't do anything, and other than just kind of talking about their ray tracing feature, which I'm sure is excellent, but we still don't know what that looks like. And I think Sony they really need to go back to the drawing board and regroup and come back with something that is meaningful for the fans and the folks out there.
I think that was one of the biggest takeaways from me from the Cerny lecture today, was when he was talking about the SSD and even ray tracing, is that we know last year that they showed a Spider-Man demo to show the advantages of SSD, how they load and rendered the entire city, and it was something like only a handful of seconds. And something as simple as that, had they demonstrated it today, would have gone a long way to at least illustrating those advantages and the evolution that the PlayStation 5 is going to offer over something like the PS4, because it would have given us a visual idea of what he's talking about. Like, when you're just saying all this technical stuff, if you don't have a video demonstration to illustrate the point, it gets lost, especially to the viewing audience today of 600,000 people who, for some reason, thought they were getting a PlayStation 5 reveal. And I mean, honestly, they sat there for 52 minutes saying, I feel like, it felt like you were back in college or a IT class or, a computer labs class for high school.
Yeah.
They didn't know what was going on. And I mean, I guess Sony could have adjusted the presentation to be a little more casual or, mass friendly. I think that was a missed opportunity for them. But where I think Microsoft is in clear control, and Sony definitely has to become more aggressive going forward, especially after today. Because even today, all the conversation for that about 1 hour period, it was about the PlayStation 5 until Microsoft updates the Xbox Series X website, and they accidentally put a release window at the bottom. Instead of just saying holiday, it said Thanksgiving 2020. And all of a sudden, that was the topic everyone was talking about. No one was talking about the SSD or the inferior teraflop figure of the PlayStation 5. They were talking about the release date of the Xbox Series X. And maybe it was a mistake by a Microsoft intern, or maybe it was a calculated decision by Microsoft to say, let's get the focus back on us, because we had it the other day. Sony's going to have it for a couple of hours,
Yeah.
but we want to be the talk of the town again, because we know Microsoft is planning a huge E3
Yep.
or E3 presentation, whatever we want to call it today, since E3 is no longer happening. And we still don't know what Sony's future is for future PlayStation 5 announcements. They have not announced the state of play, which I think had they concluded the presentation today by dating or giving at least some sort of idea of when there'll be a state of play or the next time we'll hear about the PlayStation 5, would have gone a long way with fans. It would have given an expectation of, maybe we just have to wait till May and we'll see the system, we'll see the controller, we'll see some game demos, we'll see some trailers. We'll get that excitement back, because we know Microsoft is sitting on a loaded weapon of Xbox Series X announcements. We know they're just waiting for June to come around to stop dropping the bombs. Mm-hmm. And it seems like Sony is still in the shed trying to tinker the bomb with some, they have to have their screws and screwdrivers, and they're trying to put it together still.
Yeah.
And that's just not reassuring. And if Sony's plan was to come out today and reassure their fans that they know what they're doing, they failed.
Yeah, I agree. I think the thing that's going to save Sony is games. And, Sony has a stronger lineup of games in their portfolio. They have for a long, long time. Microsoft obviously needs to do some work to catch up there. But, if what we saw with what they kind of were teasing, the next kind of Gears of War with the Series X enhancements, Halo Infinite, if that's still on track to come out this year, all of a sudden Microsoft has all the momentum again, both in hardware and software. xCloud, if you get, let's say you get three months of free xCloud when you buy a Series X, you can play pretty much any of the games on that list for 3 months for free. Then that's pretty compelling, for a console that's coming out over the Christmas or the holiday season, where people are going to want to play a lot of games over the holiday season. So I think you're right. I think Sony really needs to come back with something significant. Now, let me ask you this, Nate. We haven't talked about backward compatibility yet, and that, for me, that is the elephant in the room. Well, one of the elephants in the room with the Sony discussion that we saw. It was announced today that there would be 100 PS4 games playable at launch, and the goal is to get all 4,000 plus games up and running, which I think is achievable. I think Sony will stay true to their word and get those games to run. But one thing that was very apparent, and a lot of people were confused about this, that this wasn't just last gen was the AMD Jaguar. This is the new AMD chip. Things are just gonna flow on, and things are just gonna work without any type of emulation layer. But that turned out to be untrue, and it really just illustrates that when you're talking about getting something to run, even though it ran on a previous generation of the same architecture, there is a lot of work that needs to go into this stuff. This is not just hey, I upgraded my CPU in my PC and I'm still playing the same games that I played 5 years ago because they still work. That's it. Those things don't apply. We're talking about highly customized architectures with differentials in CPU, GPU, the architecture, the audio. Just everything is different, even though it's the same, AMD, x86 architecture. And it really just illustrates to me, and I've always said this, that Sony, and Jim Ryan has confirmed this numerous times as well, that Sony doesn't really put as much stock into backward compatibility, nowhere near as much as what Microsoft has. From the day that Microsoft were talking about the Xbox 360, they were thinking about how can we play the OG Xbox games on this system, and that mindset has never changed. They have dedicated teams that they spend millions and millions of dollars on research and development on to make games kind of being brought forward to the next generation. And I can probably, say this fairly confidently that even though it's the Series X right now, there is probably a team right now researching emulation for the next generation after this. I mean, Microsoft has always been a big proponent of backward compatibility and emulation, and it's really not something that Sony has put anywhere near as much time, money, and resources into. And this was very apparent about the backward compatibility announcement today, which again surprised a lot of us. It even surprised me, because I just felt like that PS4 would be out of the box backward compatible, across everything. You put a PS4 disc in, it's essentially just thinks it's a PS4 that you're putting the disc into anyway, and it's going to play that game, albeit with up-res and upscaling and better frame rates and boost performance and stuff. But obviously that's not the case. I mean, I think Sony is choosing to individually tweak these games to make them work. And I want to hear your thoughts on what you thought about the backward compatibility stuff on the Sony side.
I was definitely taken aback by the announcement of 100 games at launch, especially since one of the reasoning is that the PlayStation 5 is too fast for some games. And it's odd to me that the newest member of the console manufacturer trio, being Microsoft, is the most committed to honoring and respecting their legacy of software. And like you, I expected I could just take my copy of Final Fantasy VII Remake, pop it in my PlayStation 5 later this year, and play the game without a problem. And now that may not even be an option. And I also expected, at least, at the minimum, PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2 games to be emulated similar to what Microsoft is doing with the original Xbox games on the Xbox One today, where I can put in a disc. If it is part of your digital service, I get the digital copy, all well. Maybe you clean up the visuals a little bit through a similar solution that Microsoft has, like we saw at Ninja Gaiden. You didn't have to patch anything. You just got 4K. It upgraded itself just due to the hardware. Mm-hmm. I was expecting a solution similar to that, and instead it seems like it's very much Jim Ryan's Sony, the man who mocked the idea of playing a PlayStation 1 game, where he said, who would want to play that? And that's what today's announcement reflected to me, is that Sony doesn't seem to care much about their legacy. And a lot of people criticize Nintendo, and rightfully so, with the way they're handling legacy content on the Nintendo Switch, which is limited basically to just the Nintendo Switch Online service. There's no virtual console. And it doesn't seem like Sony's going to do any better than that moving into the next gen. And I mean, frankly, Sony didn't do a great job with backwards compatibility on the PlayStation 4. They almost completely ignored it until they started throwing up some PlayStation 2 games on, was it PlayStation Now, and even PlayStation 3 games on that service. But otherwise, it wasn't a focus for them this generation, and it still seems like it's not a focus for them moving forward. Whereas Microsoft is already saying, day one, you have access to, I believe they said, over 500 Xbox family games dating back to the original Xbox 360, the Xbox One. And Microsoft is committed to so many different facets of the industry and to their consuming base that they really seem like they're pro-consumer. And Sony's just kind of like, well, if you want to play, I mean, I'm almost expecting an executive to say, you want to play PlayStation 4 games? We have a system for that. It's called the PlayStation 4. And it blows my mind that Sony, and I'm going to use this term, even it's probably going to piss some people off. To me, this is the Sony of the PlayStation 3 era, also known as arrogant Sony. They're feeling their stride. They thought they could do no wrong. And like the PS3 and 360 generation, here comes Microsoft kicking them in the back saying, no, we're here, we're ready to compete, and we're doing a lot better than you think we're going to. And I mean, for Microsoft to be the industry leader for backwards compatibility, who ever would have thought that?
Yep.
It's hopefully Sony adapts.
You bring up some good points, and look, I'll be the first one to admit that I felt like Microsoft was weak this time a year ago, and they were, right? I mean, remember this time last year, we were waiting for the next Gears of War game, and we hadn't seen anything about it. You know, we'd heard it was coming, and then I think State of Decay was coming out or something. I mean, they didn't really have anything on the horizon that was really anything that was compelling to anyone. And then, man, since then they have just been slam dunking everything that they've done. They've just worked their way back into a commanding position to really take the next gen and just, you know, take it by the scruff of the neck and say, you know what, we're tired of being number 2, number 3. We want to go for number 1 and really and mean it this time. You know, the 360 was obviously the last time they had that opportunity to be number 1, and they were for a long time. Obviously, PS3 kind of, you know, beat them at the end there. You know, Red Ring of Death and all that stuff happened, but this time around, you know, they have a clear shot at really being number 1. But I think Sony, even though I would be feeling a little nervous if I was Sony today, it all comes back to what games do they have for us? Because if they bring Horizon 2, or they bring a trailer for the next God of War, or if they, you know what I'm saying, if they bring their heavy hitter games, or not all of them, but if they bring some trailers for what's coming, they bring a new Gran Turismo game to the table, maybe you know, another Infamous game. All of a sudden, that's like, you know what? It's not about the hardware. It's not about, you know, teraflops. It's about these games that we've you know, sold millions of copies for many years, that our fans absolutely love and enjoy, and we're going to give them a taste of the next generation of all these games that are going to run at 4K 60, and they're going to absolutely blow your mind, and we're going to continue to give the fans what they want, and that is, you know, the best games that we can develop. So I am, you know, I'm still holding out that Sony will come to the table with some killer games, but I do agree with you that there seems to be that same cycle of arrogance that Sony has after the PS2 just dominated everything. Same thing with the PS4. It absolutely killed the competition, well, killed the Xbox One, and it seems like history is going to repeat itself. I hope it doesn't, because things are a lot different these days than they were, but we'll see, man. We'll see, you know, man, the next couple of months, you know, the next like 6 weeks, 2 months, 3 months are going to be some of the most interesting times in video game history. I'm very interested to see, you know, where Sony comes out of this GDC thing, which ultimately I think probably was something that shouldn't have been, you know, made public. It's something that should have just been sent to whoever was registered for GDC that was going to attend, and internal Sony people. And I don't really think this was something that the public really needed to see. And you know, media, of course. I mean, they would report on that stuff. But other than that, why bring this out to the public when it just, you know, you gotta, you know, if you make a presentation or if you make an announcement, you gotta know who your target audience is. And they must have known that the target audience are going to be rabid Sony fanboys that want to know every minute detail about the hardware, as well as Xbox, you know, fanboys that you know, want to know, well, how far away is the PS5 from the Xbox Series X? Is it truly a more powerful system? And as soon as they got a whiff of the PS5 wasn't going to be, you know, more powerful, that was it. That's all they needed to hear. You know, no one cared about the Sony kind of technical lecture that we got, which I thought was interesting, and I kind of liked it. But most people just took away from that was the Sony PS5 is not even powerful, nowhere near powerful as the Series X, and it seems like they have a long way to go.
And that's the thing. Like, they definitely should not have made the presentation that we saw today public. The information it's valuable. It's definitely well worth having out to the public and as far as information. But the presentation was made for a very small audience because it was designed with developers in mind. It's meant for a GDC briefing of developers and publishers and, certain media outlets. It's not made for Joe Schmo who buys a PlayStation 4 to buy Madden, but saw all the social media hype over the last, 24 hours and decided to tune in because they thought they were going to see trailers of the next, God of War game or whatever, and instead were treated to a lecture from Mark Cerny, and that caused a ripple in social media of Sony. What the hell was that? And I mean, I don't blame Sony for it. They marketed it clearly as an architectural briefing by Mark Cerny to talk about the architecture of the PlayStation 5 and how it's going to impact games in the future. It was the failure of the media and YouTube of hyping the event to be something it was never going to be. And like, to return to your point about like games, that's going to be the selling point. Right now, Microsoft has the edge in terms of power because nobody cares about the SSD speed as far as the casual buyer goes. They don't know what that means. They don't care about the RAM and the memory bandwidth and the IO throughput. None of that matters. What they see when they go to Microsoft's website for the Series X is 12 teraflops in big, bold letters and Microsoft wording saying the most powerful hardware. And that's all that matters. Like, this isn't even an Xbox One X situation where, yeah, that was the most powerful piece of hardware on the market, but it came out years later after the Xbox One had already launched. Microsoft could not recover and fix that product line. It was toxic pretty much from day one as soon as they did their initial media briefing, where at the time the system had no used games. You always had to be online. It was toxic from that moment. Right now, the Xbox Series X, there's no toxicity. There is no cloud over it pouring rain. It's sunshine and rainbows. Microsoft is just killing it with their marketing, and even using Hellblade 2 at the Video Game Awards was a good choice. We've already seen a teaser of Halo Infinite, and if the rumors are true, and Microsoft comes out at E3 with potentially a new Perfect Dark, a new Fable, a new Forza, they're going to look like the Microsoft of old, where they're returning to their roots, and they're bringing the games that people have been asking. And we know Sony's going to be there with their pedigree of first-party software. There's no question about it. And the way they're approaching backwards compatibility actually put a thought in my mind where I kind of expected this new generation wouldn't lean so heavily on remastered ports of the previous generation. And I wonder if Sony factored that into the decision making, saying, well, we're going to release The Last of Us Part 2, but if we make that backwards compatible on the PlayStation 5, we can't sell a improved or enhanced version of The Last of Us Part 2 for the PlayStation 5 because I can just buy the PS4 version, pop it in, probably get PlayStation 4 Pro type performance, which is going to be more than satisfying. But now I remove that option for you. You have a PlayStation 5, I'm going to release the enhanced version. Which version of the game you're going to buy? You're going to double dip. Because you're going to want those extra features all of a sudden.
That's correct.
I wonder if that factored into Sony's decision making in any way. I mean, Jim Ryan, he's a businessman. He's all about the numbers. And when you're crunching numbers, you're looking for you're looking for profit. And what's a better means of profit than double dipping on the same game?
Yep. Absolutely agree. Nate, my question is to you, now that we haven't really seen anything from the PS5 camp, but we have an idea on specs. Do you think, you and I have always said that the Series X is a $499 system, even though a lot of people, think it's going to be more expensive. And up until today, I've always said that the PS5 was a $499 system. Do you think that the PS5, based on what we've seen spec-wise, again, we haven't seen a controller, we haven't seen the hardware, but based on what we've seen, do you think it's still a $499 system, or do you think Sony is going to try to undercut Microsoft by like $50 or $100, or what do you think it's going to ultimately end up being?
Based on the specs given today, I can see Sony flirting with the idea and exploring the idea of a 399 release and potentially taking a $25 to $50 hit on the hardware in an effort to undercut Microsoft if Microsoft is indeed targeting 499. But right now, because Microsoft is, as we put in the past, they're playing a game of cat and mouse and Microsoft is the cat. I think Microsoft is fully aware of what Sony is probably thinking about pricing. And if Microsoft is preparing for Sony to maybe try to undercut them at 399, I wouldn't be surprised if Microsoft is now thinking to themselves after today's reception of, we'll take a $75 hit if we have to, and we'll match you at $399, because the one thing Microsoft will not want to give Sony is any type of advantage. Microsoft has the power advantage. They have the more positive word of mouth among casual consumers right now. And if Microsoft matches them at price, Sony does not look strong in any position at that point, because it's just going to be, hey, we're a $399 system. That's great. It's affordable. I hope both, hit that price just from an affordability standpoint. But if you're Sony, I'm a less powerful system. What's my leverage?
Yeah.
And I think Microsoft is aware of that right now.
I would agree. I think for me, the smart move for Sony is they get ahead of it. They come out and proudly announce that the PS5 is a $399 system. Maybe throw Microsoft a little off guard with that, because they probably think it's going to be more expensive. And, throw in the Blue Point game, and, we'll say, and, anyone that's listening, I don't know anything, so, don't take this to heart or anything, but Horizon Zero Dawn 2 is, the two heavy hitter launch games. And that would be enough, to rattle Microsoft, I think. I'm not saying it's going to, knock them out or anything like that, or hit them with a haymaker, but that would be a statement to say, we know what we're doing, Microsoft. We've got this under control. We've got some good games coming up, and we've got a cheaper system than you guys. Now let's see what you guys have. I think that's really the play that I would see Sony try to make. If they want to come out with a power move.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think Sony's plan is definitely to try to come out at, after seeing the specs today, they definitely want to come out lower than Microsoft. It's just a matter of if they can. And I do believe Microsoft is aware of what Sony is going to try. I mean, based on the specs, I still see Microsoft probably thinking $499 for the Series X. And I think that would still be a good value based on what we've seen of the system. And I mean, $399 would be an excellent value even for the PlayStation 5. But right now, Microsoft just hasn't really made that marketing mistake. And I don't know if Sony came out tomorrow and said PS5's $399, I think Microsoft would come out soon after and say, we're $399 too. We're not going to let them undercut us by $100 like they did last generation, because that was a big reason.
Yeah.
They got that, huge sales edge on us early on. And I mean, Microsoft just seems to be rectifying every basic mistake they made.
Yeah. And they have xCloud, so they can supplement, a cheaper price with xCloud subs. They've got a lot more leverage. They've got a lot more, maneuverability there. So that's definitely something that Microsoft could easily come back and say, we're going to match whatever you guys decide to price your system at, because we'll just we'll set everyone up with xCloud and we'll recoup our money that way. And I think that's definitely something that they have up their sleeve.
Right. Now, if I just remove the whole competitive marketing aspect of it, then I would still say $499 Series X, $399 to $449 for the PlayStation 5. Just that's just removing any competition. If we lived in a vacuum and just had to price these systems without, Microsoft and Sony just glaring at each other across the table saying, what are you thinking? So I'm curious which company blinks first.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I think Microsoft is going to continue to, control the narrative. I will say that I don't see that changing between now and literally the day that they launch this thing. I think Microsoft is going to continue to go first with everything, and I think it's the right thing for them to do. Which is unfortunate for Sony because, they've always been that leader in this space where they've done their own thing as well. But I do think that they are a little rattled by Microsoft, and they are kind of waiting to see what they price their system at before they ultimately decide to make a move, which I don't think is the right thing to do. But I do think it's the way things are going to play out this year.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess this will be the last topic we'll touch on. Earlier today, Sony's PR told, let me see if I can find the website. I believe it was Spiel Times. Sony told them that right now, the situation going on in the world has not yet delayed the launch of the PlayStation 5, which I wouldn't say is too shocking. We've said it numerous times that Microsoft and Sony have until about May or June before they really have any concern about next-gen launch plans, because that's around the time you would ramp up manufacturing and really begin to see how many units you can produce a month. But right now, it doesn't seem like Sony has any concern or fear about needing to delay the PlayStation 5 into 2021. And we had the Microsoft leak, or whatever you want to call it, on their website saying Thanksgiving. So as of right now, both systems are on track for 2020. Do you think one of these two could potentially get delayed, or do you think we'll see staggered releases in certain regions? Like Europe and Japan aren't particularly strong markets for Microsoft, so they would probably focus primarily on North America for their November launch, whereas Sony's kind of lost the Japanese market to Nintendo because Japan's has moved over to the portable gaming world. So if you're Sony, do you still try to launch worldwide, or do you say if we only can produce, we'll say 3 million units by November, do you just launch in North America, or do you say let's wait until spring and do a worldwide launch in all three major regions?
I think the PS5 gets pushed. I think I've mentioned it a couple of times in previous discussions we've had and on the Spawncast, but I do think that the PlayStation 5 will push out. I don't think it's going to push out much, but it may go to spring next year, which, I mean, it's going to hurt them, but it's not something that they can't recover from, given the millions and millions of, or 100 million systems they sold, with the PS4, but it will definitely put them behind the eight ball. But I do think it's something that they can afford to take a little bit of a hit on, because I think they confidently do think that they can make up those numbers and then overtake Microsoft, at some point. I say that it's going to be delayed because it just, for me, it seems like this is a perfect storm with everything that's happening around the world right now, with what we've seen so far from the Sony camp, or what we haven't seen from the Sony camp, and we're almost into April. We're in the second week of March. It's hard for me to imagine that we're going to see a system launch at the end of this year during the holiday season. But we'll see. I mean, we can only go on the information that's been given to us at this point, and the information is, 2020 holiday. So we'll definitely see what comes out of that. Do I think they're going to stagger the launch and have, say, 3 million units available on day one, and then a shortage, and then they bring in more systems? I think that's very dangerous in 2020, Nate. I think that, for people that don't get their hands on one, it's really going to be something that they may not realize. They may just turn around and say, I don't really think I wanted this anyway. The PS4 is a more than capable system for me, and it's going to continue to be for the next 2 years. Why do I really need a PS5? So it's not really the same thing as like when the Wii came out, where there were shortages, because before the Wii was the GameCube, and no one bought a GameCube, but everyone wanted a Wii. Very, very different circumstances. The 360 was the same. They had a scheduled launch around the world. And as someone who lived in Australia at the time, I had to wait 3 months for a system before, when the PAL versions came out. And I just imported one from overseas because I couldn't wait that long. But, things are different these days. We live in an age where, there has to be a compelling reason to upgrade to a new console. Like you said, people don't care about fast SSDs other than people like us, because we like to geek out about stuff, stuff like that. But the average consumer out there isn't going to care about, SSDs or the next generation or 8K and stuff like that. They just want to play video games, and if the PS5 is the new system that plays their video games that they want to play, but it's not something that is available to them, well, guess what? There's PS4, cross-compatible versions of all the same games that you can get on the PS5. So why do I need to upgrade to a PS5? So I think that, with those types of reasonings, I think that, it's not going to be a staggered launch. It's going to be an all or nothing thing, and I just don't see. And again, I don't have any information to go off on except other than my gut right now and what I've seen online. I just feel like that the PS5 is probably going to push out to next year.
Yeah, I can definitely see that playing out as a reality. My hope and belief is that we at least see both platforms release in North America this holiday, and I could see the PlayStation getting pushed to spring for Europe and Japan, and Microsoft just kind of does their rollout in those regions whenever they see fit, because they really don't focus on those regions at all.
Yeah.
But we definitely have a lot to look forward to in the next six to 8 months as we find out more information. I mean, today was Sony gave us an appetizer to an appetizer today. Microsoft just continues to treat us with sweet desserts, and we're still waiting for that main entree to come in.
Right.
And I mean, I think my takeaway from today was how distinctly different the messaging from Microsoft and Sony has been regarding their next gen systems. Like, we saw Sony come in today where it was development focused, it was a deep dive, there was a lot of detail where no one watching really understood what was happening. Whereas Microsoft is handing off such information to outlets like Digital Foundry so they can make videos and write articles that explain all of that in layman terms, but it's enough to get people interested. And I mean, Microsoft was smart to use the Game Awards as the launch pad for the Series X because it's a consumer affair. It reached out directly to those people who would be buying their system, and we're still waiting for Sony to do that. And I mean, it's going to come. I mean, and just to make it clear, because I'm sure people think we probably bashed or hated on Sony a lot over this, the past hour or so. We both think the PlayStation 5 is going to be an outstanding system. It's going to have great games. We're just talking about the perception of the marketing point that Sony has had up to now. Yeah. They're just not flowing well. They seem off their game for some reason, whereas Microsoft is strutting down the street and everyone is aware of it. They can tell they're confident, and Sony's that nerdy kid in class trying to give a presentation, and he's, they're shaking and they're nervous, and Microsoft is the jock standing next to them delivering an awesome presentation. And you can tell it's not lack of confidence in Sony to deliver. It's just Sony doesn't seem confident in their delivery and product at this point.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything you said. And I guess my final word on this is, you don't agree with me, but the console wars are back, baby. I mean, this is console war 101 right here. This is trench warfare, and Microsoft is absolutely demolishing Sony right now. And hopefully Sony can run some offense themselves and get back where they need to be.
The console wars are over. But that is a video for another day. Once we get some real solid information from Sony with their software and even from Microsoft, then we can touch on that and the console wars and whether or not they are over. But until next time, that is all we have for this episode of Nate the Hate. You can find MVG's channel link in the description below. Be sure to give the video a like if you enjoyed this content. Give it a dislike if you did not. Let us know your thoughts on the PlayStation 5 in the comment section below and whether or not you like Sony's presentation. And until next time, continue to embrace the hate.